Hello.
After my father died, all his property and assets went to his pregnant young wife. She hates me and threatens to throw me out on the street. Jake was only 15 when his whole world flipped upside down. The day started out like any other. He'd been heading home from school, lost in thought as he mentally ran through his evening plans. Some homework, maybe a quick round of video games before dinner, and then he'd help his mom out in the yard like he'd promised. It was a perfectly ordinary day, and he had no clue it would end with news that would change everything. As Jake turned onto his street, he noticed an unfamiliar car in the driveway. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. A strange, uneasy feeling crept over him. A feeling he'd later realize was his first sign that something was terribly wrong. When he opened the front door, the sight that greeted him shattered any sense of normalcy he might have held on to. His mother, Clara, was sitting at the kitchen table, gripping a crumpled tissue in her shaking hands. Across from her was a man dressed in a dark suit, a briefcase resting on the table in front of him. Clara looked up as Jake walked in, her face pale, streaked with tears. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "There's been an accident." She didn't need to say anything more. Jake knew his dad, Robert, had been away on a long business trip, but he never dreamed he'd never see him again. The man in the suit, a lawyer, Jake would soon learn, began explaining the unthinkable. His father's car had been in a terrible crash on a highway far from home. The collision had been fatal. Robert hadn't survived. A hollow emptiness filled Jake as he absorbed the words, unable to even react. He sank into a chair, the lawyer's voice becoming a distant hum. His mother's grief-stricken face blurring as if he were watching the whole scene from outside his own body. After what felt like forever, the lawyer's voice broke through the fog. "Your father left you something, Jake," he said, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a sealed envelope. Jake took it with shaking hands, his eyes falling on the neat handwriting spelling out his name. Inside were his father's last words to him, words he'd never get to hear spoken aloud. But that wasn't all. The lawyer went on to explain that Robert had left behind more than just words. There was an inheritance. The house, some investments, and money meant to support Jake's future, for college or, as the lawyer put it, whatever you might need to get your life on track. It hit Jake hard. He was just a teenager, now faced with the reality of life without his dad and the weight of new responsibilities. The house he'd grown up in was now his, an overwhelming thought, especially when he looked around at the scuffed floors from years of toy cars and the smudges on the walls from his childhood. The days that followed only got tougher. His mom tried to stay strong, doing her best to hold things together, but grief had its way of breaking even the strongest people. The house felt different now, empty and cold, like all the warmth and laughter had left with his dad. His father's empty chair at the kitchen table became a constant, painful reminder of the void left behind. One evening, Clara called him over to the table again, her voice carrying a different tone. "Jake," she began softly, her voice filled with a seriousness he'd rarely heard. "We need to talk about what this means for us." Jake's mom, Clara, said softly, her face tense. Jake looked at her, not entirely understanding. She explained that even though the house was in his name now, they'd have to make some important decisions together. They were both still trying to process everything, but she hinted that managing the house and his father's inheritance would take careful planning. Over the next few weeks, as they discussed these details, Jake noticed subtle but strange changes in his mom's behavior. Clara seemed to be pulling back emotionally, becoming more private and even a bit secretive. He'd walk into a room to find her hurriedly closing her laptop or sliding papers into a drawer. She was on the phone constantly, speaking with people Jake had never heard her mention before. Every now and then, he'd catch bits and pieces of her conversations, filled with unfamiliar terms like appraisal, liquidity, and equity. They were words Jake didn't remember her using, ever. One evening, as Jake walked into the kitchen to grab a drink, he overheard her on the phone, her voice low and anxious. "Yes, but the house is still legally Jake's," she whispered. "I just need more time to figure this out." She suddenly noticed him standing there, and for a brief second, her expression faltered, a flash of guilt passing over her face before she quickly plastered on a reassuring smile. "Oh, hey Jake, just some business stuff, nothing for you to worry about." But Jake wasn't convinced. Something felt off, and a nagging suspicion began to take root. As the months went by, Clara's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Jake would come home from school to find her gone, often with no explanation of where she'd been. She rarely asked about his schoolwork, and meals together became almost non-existent. Her mood swung unpredictably. One moment she'd be affectionate and chatty, and the next, distant and distracted. Then, one afternoon, Jake came across a stack of papers lying out on the dining table. Curiosity got the best of him, and he glanced at the top page. His heart sank as he read the title, Notice of Property Evaluation. Panic flooded through him. Was his mom planning to sell the house? The thought horrified him. This was his home, filled with memories of his dad, of their life together. He couldn't imagine letting it go. When he confronted Clara about it, she brushed his concerns aside with a light laugh. "Oh, Jake," she said dismissively, "it's just precautionary paperwork. There's nothing to worry about." But Jake didn't buy it. He felt certain she wasn't telling him the whole story. As the weeks wore on, more unusual things began happening. His mom started receiving mail marked with official-looking seals, which she'd stash away quickly, refusing to discuss them. It felt as if she were hiding something big, something she didn't want him to know. One day, while tidying up the hall closet, Jake found a small, dusty box tucked behind some old jackets. Curious, he opened it and discovered a stack of unfamiliar documents. The box was stuffed with letters from various banks and attorneys, and then Jake found something that made his blood run cold. A crumpled note, scrawled in his father's handwriting. For Jake, hold on to what's yours. The message sent a chill down his spine, deepening his unease about his mother's intentions. Shortly after, Clara shocked him with an announcement. She sat him down, giving him a strained smile, and said, "We're going to sell the house, Jake. I found us a new place. A fresh start." Jake's world tilted. "Sell the house? No, Mom. Dad left this for us, for me." Clara's face hardened. "It's just a house, Jake. You need to let it go." To Jake, it was anything but just a house. Every corner, every wall held memories of his dad, of their life together. Desperately, he argued, tried to reason with her, but Clara's mind was already made up. He felt a sense of betrayal, anger, and confusion washing over him. What had happened to the caring mom he once knew? She was like a stranger, someone who seemed to be putting her own desires above his father's legacy. As the sale date crept closer, Jake felt a desperation like never before. He had to do something to stop this, but he was trapped. Clara was his legal guardian, and though the house was in his name, she still held all the power. The night before the sale was set to go through, Jake found himself alone in his father's study, clutching the crumpled note. "Hold on to what's yours." His father's words felt like a whisper from beyond, urging him to keep fighting. Determined, he sifted through every document his father had left behind, searching for anything that could help him. Then he found it, a copy of his father's will, which clearly stated his wishes that the house and inheritance remain under Jake's control until he turned 18. His father had protected him even in death. The next morning, armed with the will, Jake confronted his mother. Clara's face went ashen when she saw the document. A tense, bitter exchange followed, leaving both of them in tears. But in the end, Jake managed to stop the sale, holding on to the one place that still felt like home. He knew the struggle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He was ready to fight to honor his father's memory and protect what was his. In the months that followed, Jake began noticing his mother changing in unsettling ways. She grew increasingly distant, often disappearing for hours without any explanation. She'd come home late, with an energy he hadn't seen in her since before his father's death. The change was strange, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on beneath the surface. At first, the changes in his mom were subtle, things Jake tried to ignore. but soon they became impossible to dismiss. One evening, Clara came home with a man. He was tall, with slicked-back hair and a smile that was friendly yet somehow too perfect. His clothes were sharp, an expensive-looking button-down and pressed pants, and he carried himself with an air of confidence that felt out of place in their quiet suburban home. "Jake," Clara said, her voice a little too cheerful. "This is Tom." Jake looked at the man, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Something about Tom's expression made him uneasy, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Tom extended a hand, and Jake shook it, reluctantly. "Hey there, champ," Tom said with a grin that felt more like a smirk. "Your mom's told me a lot about you." The comment stung. It was hard to believe his mother had been talking about him to this stranger. Jake forced a polite smile, but his mind was racing. Why had she brought Tom home so soon, after everything they'd gone through with his father's death and the inheritance struggles? Over the following weeks, Tom became a fixture in their home. He and Clara seemed inseparable, spending evenings together, going out on weekends, and often leaving Jake behind without much of an explanation. He felt like an outsider, watching his mom and Tom grow closer with each passing day. And then came the announcement that took his breath away. Clara sat him down and, with a bright, forced smile, told him, "Tom's going to move in with us." Jake was stunned. She hadn't asked him how he felt about it, and he definitely didn't agree. It felt like she was pushing his father's memory aside to make space for Tom. When he tried to express his feelings, his protests fell on deaf ears. "Oh, Jake, don't be difficult," Clara said, brushing off his concerns. "Tom's a wonderful man, and he cares about us. Besides, it'll be good for us to have someone like him around." Jake wanted to argue, to tell her she barely even knew Tom, but the look in her eyes told him it was useless. She'd already made up her mind, and trying to change it would only push her further away. Once Tom officially moved in, the house's atmosphere shifted immediately. He began making changes right away, rearranging furniture, bringing in new decorations, even suggesting a new layout for some of the rooms. Jake's room was one of the few places left untouched, a small bubble of familiarity in a house that was quickly becoming unrecognizable. But even there, he could feel Tom's presence creeping in. Tom didn't stop at redecorating. He started imposing rules around the house. Strict curfews, limits on where Jake could go, and even who he could hang out with. Things took an even darker turn when Tom began referring to himself as Jake's father figure. "You know, Jake," he'd say with that same forced smile, "every boy needs a strong male role model. I'm here to help you become a man," Tom would say, flashing that smug smile. Every time Jake heard it, he bristled. His dad hadn't been gone long, and here was Tom waltzing in, acting as if he could fill that role, as if he had any right to replace the father Jake had lost. What stung even more was seeing his mom nod along, approvingly agreeing whenever Tom talked about raising Jake right. The breaking point came one afternoon when Tom barged into Jake's room without so much as a knock. Jake jumped up, startled, feeling his privacy completely violated. "Look, champ," Tom said, casually glancing around the room, "we need to talk about how you're keeping this place. It's a mess." Jake looked around, confused. His room was far from spotless, but he kept it organized enough. Tom didn't stop there, though. He strolled over to Jake's bookshelf, picking up items and scrutinizing them like he had a right to judge. Stopping in front of Jake's old baseball trophies, he raised an eyebrow. "These," Tom said, waving a dismissive hand at them, "they take up way too much space. Maybe it's time you outgrew them." Jake felt anger bubble up. "My dad got me those trophies," he said through clenched teeth. But Tom just smirked. "Your mom says I'm in charge here, Jake. I think it's time we make a few changes." Later, when Jake confronted his mom, she shrugged it off. "Tom's just trying to help, Jake. He wants the best for us. You need to give him a chance." But for Jake, it wasn't just Tom invading his space. Tom's control was creeping into every part of their lives. He began dictating when they'd eat, where they'd go on weekends, and even simple routines around the house. Anytime Jake pushed back, Tom would respond with patronizing comments, and his mom would defend Tom. Worst of all, Tom had a way of subtly driving a wedge between Jake and his mother. He'd make little digs when she was around, casting Jake as irresponsible or ungrateful. Maybe if Jake helped out more, he'd say loud enough for her to hear. We wouldn't have to worry so much about keeping the place up. Over time, Clara began siding with Tom more and more, and the playful arguments she used to have with Jake became tense, ending in cold silences or lectures. Jake felt like he was losing his mom all over again, and it hurt in a way he hadn't expected. Then came the day that left him feeling completely blindsided. He was sitting nearby in the living room, pretending to focus on his homework, when he overheard Tom talking to his mom. "This place is too big, Clara," Tom was saying smoothly. "It's old and falling apart. We could sell it, find something newer, something that's really ours." Jake held his breath, waiting for his mom to shut the idea down. But instead, she hesitated, her voice soft. "I don't know," she replied slowly. "It's just, there are so many memories here," his mom said, her voice softening. Tom took her hand, nodding sympathetically. "Exactly. Memories," he said, squeezing her hand as if to comfort her. "Sometimes we have to let go of the past to make room for the future." Jake's heart sank. Tom's influence over his mother was even stronger than he'd realized, and from the look in her eyes, it was clear she was already considering the idea of selling their home. That night, Jake couldn't hold back any longer. He confronted her, desperation in his voice. "You can't sell the house, Mom. Dad left it to us for a reason. He wanted us to have a home, somewhere safe." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and sympathy. "Jake, I know this is hard for you," she said softly, "but Tom is right. This house, it's just bricks and wood. We can make new memories somewhere else, start fresh." To Jake, it was so much more than that. This house was his last connection to his father, the only solid reminder of the life they'd once shared. But as he searched her face, he saw that his mother was no longer the woman she'd been when his father was alive. Tom had changed her, turning her into someone willing to toss aside the past without a second thought. Over the following weeks, Jake felt himself pulling back more and more. He avoided Tom as much as possible, staying late at school, spending weekends at friends' houses, and even retreating to the library just to escape. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching his home slip away, piece by piece. One evening, he overheard Tom on the phone. The conversation was quiet, but he caught enough to understand what was happening. Tom was talking to a real estate agent, discussing the market value of the house. Jake's stomach twisted as he realized that selling his family home wasn't just an idea. It was already in motion. Desperate, Jake confronted his mom again, telling her about the conversation he'd overheard, explaining that Tom was already planning the sale behind his back. But she only sighed, her face softening as she looked at him with a pitying expression. "Jake," she said, "I know you don't like change, but Tom has done so much for us. He's brought stability back into our lives. He just wants what's best." Stability? Jake could hardly believe his ears. Tom had done nothing but turn their world upside down, taking control of the house, alienating him from his mother, and now trying to sell the one place that still felt like home. He felt utterly trapped, powerless to stop the whirlwind of changes Tom had unleashed on their lives. As the days passed, the house grew stranger to him, filled with Tom's rules and his mother's indifference. Jake felt himself being pushed out, as if he were an intruder in his own life. He knew he had to find a way to protect what little he had left of his father's memory, but he also knew it was a fight he'd have to face alone. Against forces he couldn't fully grasp, Jake felt the looming sale of the house hang over him like a storm cloud. It was a relentless reminder that his connection to his father, and even his own sense of self, was slipping away. With each passing day, it became painfully clear that Tom had no intention of letting him hold onto any of it. Jake's home had become almost unrecognizable, and if having Tom move in wasn't enough, he'd brought along his two children, a girl named Lily, a few years younger than Jake, and a boy, Dylan, who was about his age. It didn't take long for Tom's kids to settle in. In fact, they seemed almost too comfortable, treating the house as though they'd lived there forever. They claimed parts of the home for themselves and quickly monopolized his mother's attention, as if it was theirs by right. For the first few weeks, Jake tried his best to adjust. He made an effort to bond with Lily and Dylan, offering to show them around the neighborhood, even inviting them to hang out at the park with him and his friends. But Dylan scoffed at the idea, brushing Jake off with snide remarks and making it clear he didn't want to be seen with the kid still clinging to the past. Lily, though quieter, carried an air of entitlement, treating Jake's family's possessions as if they'd always been hers. What hurt Jake the most was how quickly his mother seemed to go along with it. Tom openly favored his kids, but it was even worse seeing his mother fussing over them without a second thought. She'd make Dylan his favorite meals or spend hours helping Lily with her homework, while Jake was often left to fend for himself. Then, one weekend, Jake overheard his mom and Tom discussing a family trip to the beach. For a moment, his heart lifted. This could be a chance to reconnect with her, to maybe even start bonding with this new family. He listened, waiting for her to call him over and invite him along, but his hopes were crushed almost immediately. Instead, he heard her say, Jake's grandparents offered to take him for the weekend. It'll be nice for him to spend some time with them. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She was sending him away so she could go on a trip with Tom and his kids. That night, he confronted her. "Mom, why can't I go with you?" he asked, his voice shaking but determined. "I'm your son, too." His mom hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Jake, honey, it's not like that," she replied, trying to sound soothing. "Tom and I just thought it would be nice for you to spend some time with Grandma and Grandpa. They miss you and, well, it's not always easy for everyone to adjust when there are so many changes." Jake was crushed. He felt as if he were being pushed out of his own family, as though his presence had become an inconvenience. He realized that in his mother's new life with Tom, he was just one more piece of the past she seemed so willing to leave behind. His mother just patted his shoulder, brushing off his concerns with a vague smile, and as the weeks went by, this became a pattern. Every time Tom planned something, a weekend camping trip, a day at the amusement park, or even just a movie night, Jake was conveniently left out. His mother always had an excuse, some reason why it was better for him to go stay with his grandparents instead. Jake's grandparents welcomed him with open arms every time, but he could sense their sadness too. They saw what was happening, and it hurt them to see their grandson being pushed aside. His grandmother, a gentle woman with silver hair and warm eyes, would often pull him aside, saying softly, "You're always welcome here, Jake. Don't ever feel like you're alone." Her words were kind, but they didn't erase the ache of being excluded from his own family. The more time he spent at his grandparents' house, the more he felt like a stranger in his own home. Whenever he returned, he'd find little changes that told him he was gradually being replaced. His room was often rearranged, his things moved or even replaced with items Tom or his kids had chosen. Once, he came back to find his favorite movie poster, something his father had bought him, taken down and replaced by a bland, generic painting that matched Tom's modern aesthetic. When he asked his mother about it, she just shrugged. "Tom thought it would make the room look nicer," she said, as if it were no big deal. The message was painfully clear. He was becoming an inconvenience in his own home. Then came his birthday. Jake's birthday had always been a big deal. His mom used to spend weeks planning, making it a special day just for him. But this year it was barely acknowledged. That morning he came downstairs, hoping for at least a small celebration, maybe a hug from his mom. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, busy cooking breakfast for Tom's kids. "Oh, happy birthday, Jake," she said with a distracted smile when she finally noticed him. She didn't even look up from the stove. Tom and his kids muttered a half-hearted happy birthday, without a hint of enthusiasm, then went right back to discussing the camping trip they were planning for the weekend. A trip Jake hadn't been invited to. Jake clenched his fists, feeling the familiar tightness in his throat as he fought back tears. He didn't want to show his hurt in front of them, didn't want their pity. Later, he brought it up to his mother, hoping she'd see how much it hurt him to be treated like an afterthought. But she looked at him with that same infuriatingly dismissive expression. "Jake, we can do something special, just the two of us," another time she said, as if it was no big deal. "You're old enough to understand." right? In that moment, Jake realized just how far his mother had drifted. She couldn't or wouldn't see the pain her choices were causing him. It was as if the more he tried to hold on to their bond, the more she pushed him away, leaving him feeling like a stranger in the only place he'd ever called home. You're old enough to understand, right? Tom and the kids are still adjusting, and I need you to be patient, his mother had said, as if it were so simple. Her words hit him like a slap. He was always the one who had to be patient, the one expected to understand. But what about him, who was looking out for Jake while his mother poured all her attention into her new family? That night, he sat alone in his room, staring at his reflection in the mirror and wondering when he'd become invisible. He felt as if he'd been erased, his place in the family taken over by strangers who didn't care about him. His mother's indifference hurt more than he could bear, and he felt bitterness beginning to root inside him, a resentment that he couldn't shake. From there, things only worsened. Tom's son, Dylan, seemed to enjoy tormenting Jake whenever he had the chance. He'd make cutting remarks about Jake's clothes, his interests, mocking him in front of friends from school they had in common. Lily, though quieter, acted entitled, often taking Jake's things without asking and treating his belongings as if they were her own. And whenever Jake dared to stand up for himself, Tom would step in, scolding him about being a good big brother and respecting family. One evening, Jake caught Dylan rummaging through his room, rifling through his desk drawers and handling his most personal items as if they were junk. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake demanded, barely containing his anger. Dylan just smirked, tossing a glance over his shoulder. "Chill out, man. This isn't even really your room. My dad says everything in this house belongs to him now." Jake's fists clenched. He wanted to shout, to throw Dylan out and reclaim his space. But he knew what would happen. Tom would barge in, full of lectures about respecting family and maturity. He realized then that Tom and his kids weren't going anywhere, and any protest he made would just give them more fuel to paint him as the problem. But the worst betrayal came one night when he overheard his mother and Tom talking in the living room. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices were raised, and he caught a snippet of their conversation as he passed. "We need to think about what's best for our family," Tom was saying, his tone insistent. "Jake's grandparents are willing to take him more often. Maybe it's time we considered a more permanent arrangement." Jake's heart stopped. Tom was suggesting that they send him to live with his grandparents for good. And the worst part? His mother didn't instantly object. Instead, he heard her sigh deeply, as if she were actually considering it. "Maybe you're right," she replied quietly. "Jake has been struggling, and maybe some time away would be good for him." Jake backed away from the door, feeling as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. He returned to his room, numb, realizing that the only person he'd been able to count on in the world was slipping further and further away. In disbelief, Jake grappled with the reality that the house he'd grown up in, the place where he'd built countless memories with his father, was no longer his. And now it seemed his own mother was ready to send him away, also she could have a fresh start with Tom and his kids. Over the next days, Jake did everything he could to stay out of their way. He skipped family dinners, avoided outings, and spent more and more time alone in his room. He knew his mother was slipping further and further away, her loyalty shifting fully to her new family. The few times he tried to talk to her, she'd brush him off, telling him he needed to adjust, and that family means making sacrifices. But what about his sacrifices? The years he'd spent trying to be the perfect son, trying to honor his father's memory. All of it felt meaningless now. Then, one afternoon, his grandparents arrived at the house. His grandmother gently took him aside, her eyes full of sympathy. "Your mother asked if you'd like to stay with us for a while," she said softly. "We'd love to have you, Jake, but it's up to you." Jake looked at her, feeling a mix of relief and heartbreak. Part of him wanted to leave behind this place that had started to feel like a prison. But another part of him, the part that clung fiercely to his father's memory, couldn't bear the thought of leaving his home. In the end, with a heavy heart, he agreed. He packed a small bag, taking only the essentials and a few cherished mementos. As he left, He glanced back at the house, feeling an overwhelming sense of loss. His mother didn't come out to say goodbye. She was inside with Tom and his kids, laughing as if everything was perfectly normal. As Jake walked away, he felt a new, deeper loneliness. His place in the family erased by the arrival of strangers who had taken everything that once mattered. Living at his grandparents' house brought him an unexpected peace. Away from Tom's control and his mother's indifference, Jake started finding a sense of calm. The distance gave him space to heal and the quiet strength of his grandparents' support. He began to settle into a new rhythm, slowly mending the pieces of himself that had felt broken. But just as he was beginning to find his footing, his mother showed up unannounced one evening at his grandparents' doorstep. She looked worn and, for the first time, uncertain. Jake's grandmother greeted her politely, though the tension in the room was thick. His mother moved into the living room, her gaze fixed on him. "Jake," she began, her voice soft yet strangely rehearsed. "We need to talk." Jake gestured for her to sit, already bracing himself for whatever was coming next. His mother took a deep breath, avoiding his eyes as she continued. It's about the inheritance your father left you." Jake's stomach twisted. He had barely touched that money. It was a sacred part of his father's legacy, a tangible reminder of the love they'd shared and the future his dad had hoped to secure for him. He couldn't fathom why his mother would bring it up now. "Tom's been feeling uncomfortable," his mother continued, her voice softening as if coaxing him to agree. "He says it's hard to feel truly at home when, well, so much of the financial control is tied to your father's legacy." Jake stared, barely believing what he was hearing. "Are you saying Tom feels threatened by the fact that Dad left me an inheritance?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Sarah bit her lip, nodding slightly. "It's just, we thought that maybe if you could share a portion of it with us, it would help Tom feel more secure as part of the family." Jake felt a surge of anger rise in him, his voice shaking as he tried to stay calm. "Mom, that inheritance is all I have left of Dad. It's for my future, college, starting my life, things Dad wanted for me. I'm not giving it away just to make Tom feel comfortable." His mother's expression shifted, disappointment darkening her eyes. "Jake, don't you understand? We're a family now, and families make sacrifices for each other." "I've made sacrifices, Mom," he replied, barely keeping his voice steady. "I've given up my room, my place in the house, and almost every memory I had of Dad. But this is where I draw the line." The room was thick with tension, his grandmother's hand resting on his shoulder in quiet support. Sarah, however, remained unyielding. "Fine," she said coolly, her tone hardening. "But remember, Jake, sometimes family has to come first. And this attitude isn't helping anyone." The following months saw the tension between Jake and his mother deepen. Tom took every opportunity to assert his control over the household, positioning himself as the head of the family and rarely missing a chance to criticize Jake. When Jake visited, Tom would greet him with thinly veiled reproaches. "You know, it's a shame you don't appreciate what your mother and I have done to keep this family together." Jake clenched his jaw each time, swallowing his anger. He knew that speaking out would only solidify his mother's perception of him as difficult and ungrateful. But things finally reached a boiling point one evening when Tom confronted him outright. "Jake," Tom said, stepping into the room with an air of authority, "if you're going to keep visiting, you need to follow the rules of this house. That means respecting your mother's wishes and showing some gratitude for all we've done." Jake stared back in disbelief. "This was my house before it was yours, Tom. My dad built this life for us, and now you act like you own it." Tom's face reddened as he stepped closer, his posture tense and challenging. Tom leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "Listen, kid. You can either get with the program or make things easier on everyone by staying away. It's time you learned that your father's gone, and you're not calling the shots here anymore." The words cut deep, igniting every ounce of resentment Jake had felt since Tom had bulldozed his way into their lives. Without a word, Jake turned and left the house, his resolve hardening. He would fight to reclaim his home and his father's legacy. Back at his grandparents' house, Jake poured himself into his studies, focused on one goal: graduating and finally taking control of the life his father had envisioned for him. He worked hard, and when he finally graduated, he felt a surge of hope and determination. Soon after, Jake returned to the family home with a plan. He'd start restoring it, reclaiming it piece by piece. He was finally of age, and legally the house was his. He intended to honor his father's memory by bringing life back to the home his dad had built for them. But when he tried to reach out to his mom, his calls went unanswered. Tom ignored his messages as well. For weeks, Jake attempted to discuss his plan civilly, but they stonewalled him at every turn. Finally, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He hired a locksmith, changed the locks, and officially secured the house under his name. The act was both a relief and a heartache. When Sarah and Tom discovered the changed locks, their reaction was explosive. His mother stormed over to his grandparents' house, visibly furious. "How could you do this, Jake?" she shouted. "This is a family home, not just yours." Jake stood his ground, his face set with resolve. "Mom, Dad left this house for me. I'm honoring his wishes, and you and Tom have no right to deny that." Her anger softened briefly, replaced by a look of hurt. "Jake, you're tearing this family apart. Can't you see that? Tom and his kids, their family too. This selfishness, it's not what your father would have wanted." Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I've given you 2 weeks to move out, Mom. I'll help you find another place, but I'm not backing down. This is my home, and it's time I take it back." Sarah's pleas grew desperate. She tried to guilt him, to paint him as the one ruining their family. But Jake had come too far to let guilt sway him now. He loved his mother, but he also knew he had to protect what his father had left him. Then, just when he thought he'd heard every excuse, Sarah and Tom presented a new plea. Tom's daughter, Lily, was pregnant, and they claimed she needed the stability of a family home. They urged Jake to reconsider, framing it as a matter of compassion for Lily's future. They insisted that forcing them out would endanger Lily's well-being, framing it as a matter of compassion for her sake. Jake's resolve wavered for a moment, but he knew that giving in would only let them keep taking advantage of him. He looked at his mother, his heart heavy but resolute. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'll help you however I can, but you and Tom need to move out." Realizing that Jake wouldn't back down, his mother left, her expression a mix of anger and sorrow. Jake returned to the house, and with a mixture of grief and determination, he threw himself into renovations, pouring all his emotions into restoring each room. It was a bittersweet process, reclaiming his father's legacy but, in a way, losing the family he once had. Yet as he worked, a sense of peace settled over him, a kind of closure he hadn't felt in years. The pain of standing up for himself was real, but he understood that sometimes holding on to the past meant making hard choices. With every nail hammered, every wall painted, Jake honored his father's memory and slowly built a future of his own design. The sacrifices had been painful, but in the end, he knew they were necessary for the life he was determined to create.
Bye bye.